1, which corresponds with week 1 in your course, and the content for week 1 is chapter 2. So one way you can use this video is by a clarification. If you go through chapter 2 and you're confused, turn on this video, and this video goes through chapter 2 and clarifies things. Another way you can use this video is as a substitute for chapter 2. Don't read chapter 2, just watch the video. The video explains all the same information. Disclaimer, I will not be just reading chapter 2 to you. I take the ideas in the order that chapter 2 gives you, and I pitch them in a different way, in a way that makes slightly more sense to me. So if you just watch the video, you're not going to get as much information as the other students who read the book and then watched the video. Another thing you should know, so second disclaimer, is that chapter 2 just throws complicated, abstract, philosophical, logical concepts at you left and right. It doesn't really stop to give you thorough examples and then explain them. So the rest of the semester is going to make what you learn in this video more clear. Right now, we're going to learn things like modus ponens, which is probably something you've never heard before. And why would you? It's a Latin term, modus ponens, and it means the mode of putting. It's one way to reach a conclusion of an argument, and it's the way that reaches that conclusion by putting in a premise that you need to get that conclusion out. And maybe that doesn't make sense. And you'll watch the whole video and maybe it still doesn't make sense. And that's fine. You're just going to get the basic idea of everything right now, of like all of it right now. And then throughout the semester, we're going to return to each of these issues and we're going to discuss them more thoroughly with better examples. Now, an argument is the situation in which someone is trying to convince. So you know that you don't have an argument if nobody's trying to convince anybody of anything and it's just talk or information or experience. But when you're looking to identify an argument, you can try to say yes or no. Is someone trying to convince? If yes, someone's trying to convince, then very likely you have an argument. Arguments, the vessel through which you try to convince, have two main parts. The two main parts are typically called premises and conclusions. Now, the premise, you can also say support, or you can also say reasons. It's whatever you're offering as information that leads you to the conclusion. The conclusion, you can also say the point of the argument or the thesis. This is the thing that the premises or the reasoning are supposed to lead you to. So an argument has two parts, premises and conclusions. To know that you have a premise or to know that you have a conclusion, there will be words that will help you identify which is which. For the conclusion and for the premise, there's words that tell you, hey, this is probably going to be a premise, or hey, this is probably going to be a conclusion. So if I said, if it's raining, you should take an umbrella, the if tells you that a premise is coming or a reason is coming. The then, which is not on this list, would tell you that the conclusion is coming. You should take an umbrella if it's raining. The raining is the reason, and the take an umbrella is the conclusion. So you should take an umbrella is somebody's conclusion. And if they wanted to give you reasons, because you asked, why should I take an umbrella? Then they'd say, because it's raining. Because it's raining. Therefore, you should take an umbrella. So if you hear words like these, that's a context clue that you have an argument. When you hear words like so, or therefore, or thus, you get context clues that you're getting a conclusion, and the conclusion is the part of an argument. That's how words like so, therefore, thus, hence, and others tell you that there's an argument. And the same is true for the premises. When you hear words or see words, read words like because or since or if, you're getting hints that these are premises or reasons or supporting information. And that's a main part in an argument. So words like these tell you that you probably have an argument. these are context clues. There are certain contexts in which you expect there to be an argument. For example, if you go to a rally or a presidential address or some kind of debate, you expect there to be arguments in that context. Then there's contexts in which you don't expect to hear those words because you don't expect an argument, but then you're getting one. If you go on a date and you're looking to see if you're matching with the person, if you want to continue hanging out, see where it leads you, maybe you want to start going steady with the person, and let's say you agree on which restaurant to go to, so far everything seems fantastic, and then you make your order of your food and the waiter or waitress goes away, and the person with whom you're on a date starts going on this very passionate lecture. It seems that you have truly upset them with your meal choice. They thought that you were a vegetarian or a vegan or a pescatarian or something other than what you really are. And they start saying things to you. Don't you know that animals are sentient, conscious beings? Are you religious or something and you think that Lord Jesus Christ and his Father God literally made chickens so that you can eat them? How can you consume animals or animal byproducts? So you might be like, what the heck is going on right now? Well, you're in the middle of an argument. Let's recap before we move forward. Anytime there's a situation in which someone is trying to convince you or you're trying to convince somebody else, that is the context for an argument. An argument has two parts, premises and the conclusion. There are words that are going to mark which one's the premise and which one is the conclusion, usually. And when you get those indicators that there are premises or that there is a conclusion, you have the clue that this is an argument. And now can you please grab your book and turn to chapter 2, which really starts on page 16. So we start with 2.1. It says vocabulary. And what we get first is the idea of a statement. And it's juxtaposing or putting side by side and comparing the word statement with the word sentence. So you might read this and be like, what the heck, I know what both of these are. But when we're talking about argumentation or reasoning, when we're talking about philosophy or logic, what we're doing are using these words as a term of art. They mean something very specific, just like the word skirt. So you know what a skirt is, right? But sometimes skirt means to go around something, as in the hiking trail skirts the lake. Now, all of a sudden, the word you knew so well, skirt, is being used in a different way. Sentence, statement, and a lot of other words are going to be used in a very different way in the terms of these books. So don't just see that the word being defined as statement and not read it, because you might not learn what a statement is for our contexts. So the first word is statement, and it tells you that a statement is a sentence that can be true or false. And then it shows you how to turn something that's just a sentence, like go to class, into a statement, you should go to class. So notice the differences here. The differences are truth value. Some things have truth value and some things don't. A sentence like go to class does not have a truth value, meaning there is not a way to say it's true or false. And if there's not a way to say whether it's true or false, then it's not a statement, because a statement is a sentence that can be true or false. And you can turn sentences like go to class into statements like you should go to class. Imagine this. You're at a party and everyone other than you is drunk because you're the designated driver, and people are talking in the background, you're listening. One says, what should we do tomorrow? And the other one says, you should go to class. Well, their speech is blurred. They're pretty drunk. Today is Friday. Tomorrow is Saturday. And none of you go to Saturday school. It's false that you should go to class. That makes the statement, you should go to class, false. Here's a new scenario. You and your buddies are all sober on campus in the hallway, hanging out, and a teacher comes out and says, "You should go to class." And now the statement is true, imagining that the bell didn't ring, it's not after school, the teacher's not senile and needs to retire. Really, you guys should go to class. It's true. Now the statement's true. So the statement can be true, the statement could be false. That makes it a statement and not only a sentence. But if we had the sentence, "go to class," that's not true or false. That's a directive. It tells you to do something, but it's not true or false that you should go to class. So it's not a statement. It's merely a sentence. Now let's get a little bit more complicated. Instead of talking about statements, let's talk about conditional statements. A conditional statement is a statement that is slightly more complicated than typical statements. It gives you a hypothetical to go along with. It usually takes this form. If ... then ... That's a conditional statement. If you want to know if something's a conditional statement, then you should look to see if you have these words, if and then. Of course, they don't always come that way. Sometimes one or both of them are missing and it's still a conditional statement. So the antecedent and the consequent are two parts that will both be there for every conditional statement. If you want to know how to remember that, one of those tricks is that A always comes before C in the English alphabet, so antecedent always comes before consequent, but that's only if you actually have the typical form or structure of a conditional statement. If, and then here's your antecedent, then here's your antecedent. And then here's your consequent. For example, you should go to class. That is a simple directive telling you what to do or directing you on what to do. And we can make it more complicated by turning "you should go to class," which is a statement, into a conditional statement by saying, and notice the blue is the same on both, and notice that I misspelled should, but I'm not about to start all over. And this one says, if you want to do well in school, then you should go to class. This is a conditional sentence or statement because it's telling you to go to class if something. This is not a conditional statement or sentence because it just tells you what to do. Go to class would be the consequent on both. But the conditional statement has an antecedent. It tells you only go to class if you want to do well in school. Conditional statements, just like regular statements, can also be false, and there's just more ways for it to be false. So, true or false, you should go to class, makes it a statement more than a sentence. There's only one way to make this false, and that's by proving that you shouldn't go to class. If you want to do well in school, then you should go to class. There is also a way to prove this wrong. If you earn an A on the final, then you earn an A in the class. This can also be false. It can be false for different reasons, just like this one. We can attack the first part just like we can attack the second part. Let's try. If you earn an A on the final, then you'll earn an A in the class. Maybe that's something your teacher says when they're talking to a student who has a B in the class as of right now, and they're asking, how can I earn an A instead? Because, my transcript's really important, my GPA is really important, and the teacher says, if you want an A in the class, then you have to earn an A on the final, which is another way of saying that if you earn an A on the final, you'll earn an A in the class. But what about a student who already has an A in the class, and then they get a B on the final, but they're still going to earn an A in the class because the final isn't going to be worth way more than the rest of the course. And so for that person, they're going to earn an A in the class, but it's not because they satisfied what's in purple. They didn't get an A on the final, but they still got an A in the class. That would make this statement not necessarily true for that person. So there's ways to prove conditional statements false, just like there's ways to prove regular statements false. Page 17, self-assessment. Number 1, Rewrite the following conditional statements in standard if-then form. And you don't need to rewrite these. That would be a waste of time, but do them in your mind so you do the practice mentally. So if you look at A and C, both of them are already in good form other than the fact that they have left out the word then. They're both conditional statements, but you need to add the word then after the comma. So A, let me say it correctly. If you have a dog, comma, then you will have fur all over your clothes. It's true or false depending on what dog. Okay, C does the same thing. It needs a word then after the comma. Let me say it correctly. If I knew you would be late, comma, then I would have brought a book. Usually true. Okay, but B needs a lot more work than just adding a word. B reads, you will never get an A if you keep falling asleep in class. So if it wants it in standard form, it wants it to go if ... then ... So we'll just take the if and we'll read what follows it. Then we'll put a comma, add the word then, and then read the rest of the sentence. Like this. If you keep falling asleep in class, comma, then you will never get an A. Number 2, choose one. A statement is, the answer is C. A statement is a sentence that can be either true or false. This is busy work because the answer is literally on the previous page. Number 3, choose one. An antecedent is, the answer is A. The antecedent is the part that comes after the if in a conditional statement. Let's look at what B says. B says the part that comes after the then in a conditional statement, and that's called a consequent. Let's see what C says. The part that comes before the if in a conditional statement. That's an ambiguous one. What can come before if is the consequent if you have the reverse order or just random information, not necessarily the consequent or the antecedent. So C is just in there as filler. Number 4, which of the following sentences is a statement? And remember, a statement is a sentence that can be true or false. What time is it? That can't be true or false. I wish it were 8 already. If you're lying and you're stating that you wish it were 8 already just to deceive somebody into thinking that you do, but it's actually false, you don't really wish it were 8 already, then I guess B could be a statement. This is one of those questions that would be terrible on a test. C, come here at 8. Also another ambiguous one. If it was me taking this, I would not mark C. But yeah, you could write an argument showing that this could be true or false. D, 8 o'clock. Yeah, not a statement. Okay, and that's a self-assessment. Number 5 in the self-assessment is pretty weird. If you see the word only in front of if, then everything you just learned about conditional statements is backwards, because the phrase only if makes what is about to come actually the consequent, not the antecedent. So this is what you did learn, that the antecedent follows the word if, and the consequent follows the word then. The word only makes things backwards because you have the antecedent and then the words only if and then the consequent. So you have to be very careful in the future when you hear or when you read the word only to figure out what the statement that includes that word is actually telling you. And when you have only if, what follows the word if is usually the consequent, meaning the thing that comes after then in a typical sentence. Let's look at an example, and you get an example in number 5 in the self-assessment. You get this statement that you get an A in the class only if you have perfect attendance, and you're supposed to rewrite it in standard form. What's weird is that the consequent is here after the word then. You have perfect attendance. This statement is telling you that the only way to have an A in the class is to have perfect attendance. you can do an A on all your homework, all the discussion, every test, but if you don't have perfect attendance, you will not have an A. In other words, if you have an A, then you had perfect attendance. This tells you the exact same information as this. These are equivalent statements in a sense because you can translate this into standard form and it would give you that. If you have an A in the class, then you had perfect attendance because you have an A in the class only if you have perfect attendance. What number 5 in the self-assessment is asking you to translate is incorrect if you put anything like this. Even if you put it in the if-then. If you wrote, if you have perfect attendance, then you have an A in the class, even that would be wrong. There's different ways to get an A in the class according to the statement. And one way to get an A in the class is if you have perfect attendance. But you can get an A in the class if you have perfect attendance and perfect homework. This statement is leaving information out if you translated it from this. This information translated standardly, accurately, without losing information, gets translated like that. So you have to remember that your standard form only applies if you don't have the word only. Whereas if you have the word only, things change drastically. Page 18, self-assessment, question number 6, is asking us to identify the conclusion of this long paragraph, which we're told is an argument. And indeed, it is. The first phrase, according to the handbook, is just irrelevant information. If they didn't put that in there at all, then the conclusion or the premises or the argument would not be affected. So the conclusion is really easy to find in this one because the conclusion comes after one of those easy to spot words like the word so. The last sentence or part of the sentence reads, so Sam should get an F in the class. That is the conclusion. And the reason or the premise that leads to that conclusion is a conditional statement. If students cheat on an assignment, then those students should receive a fail. And the second premise is that Sam did cheat on the assignment. And so your conclusion is that Sam should get an F in the class. Just like that phrase, according to the handbook, the other phrase that he cheated on his last assignment in calculus is also irrelevant information. The whole argument could have read, premise 1, if a student cheats, then they should receive a fail. Premise 2, Sam cheated. Conclusion, Sam should fail. It could have been that simple. Let's look at that same argument and learn 2 new concepts. So here's the argument written in a very simple way, and it has 2 premises and the conclusion. And see those 3 dots? Oh, just kidding. We're going to learn 3 things. See those 3 dots? In some worlds, that is my crazy life, and it's a symbol that a lot of gangsters have tattooed right here. But in logic and philosophy for this class, when you see those same 3 dots, that is the symbol that represents a conclusion. So for us, those 3 symbols, just like that, in that order, like a triangle without the lines, is going to mean that there's a conclusion. Now I have premise 1 and indicated as 1, and premise 2 is indicated as 2, and then the conclusion is indicated with the 3 dots. So here is that same argument that you have in that self-assessment that we just looked at, and it reads that if someone cheats, then they should fail. The second premise is that Sam cheated. You must agree, if you agree with premise 1 and 2, that Sam should fail. So this is a very special argument. It is special not because of the content. We could have written anything else we wanted, but it's the form of the argument. The fact that premise 1 and premise 2, if they are true, must give us a necessarily good argument in general. It's called a valid argument. It's valid because if premise 1 is true and if premise 2 is true, then the conclusion must be true. So in your textbook on page 19, it says that validity is the description of an argument where it's not possible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So let's say you want to prove wrong that Sam should fail. Let's say you're Sam, and you have to come up with a way not to fail. And the teacher says to you, you have to fail. And you say, why do I have to fail? And they say, well, you cheated. That's premise 2. And anybody who cheats should fail. That's premise 1, that if you cheat, you should fail. Therefore, you have to fail because you cheated, and anyone who did cheat like you did should fail, so you should fail. If you want to deny the conclusion, the only way to do that by the rules of reasoning is to show that premise 1 is false or to show that premise 2 is false. If you cannot show that 1 or 2 is false, you cannot show that the conclusion is false. This is a valid argument. You probably remember equations like this from mathematics. This is a mathematical equation in which x is a variable. X stands for a number. Here, one of the possible answers that x represents is the number 1. If you plug in 1 for x, 1 plus 1 does equal 2, so you know that you've done that right. This is an analogy to something we do in logic. Here is a logical, symbolic representation of an argument. This is called modus ponens, the mode of putting, where you put the antecedent and you get the consequent. So premise 1 here is a conditional statement. If P, then Q. How about an example? Okay, if someone cheated, then they should fail. Premise 2 is the antecedent, that somebody did cheat. The conclusion is the consequent, that the person who cheated should fail. So if you wanted to rewrite this argument in symbolic logic, it would be right to put it in these terms. This is a valid argument. You know, because it fits the form called modus ponens. And modus ponens is a valid argument. It's the most simple valid argument, as simple as that. The only way to prove that Q is not true is to prove that it's false that P, or to prove that it's false that if P then Q. Remember that modus ponens is a valid argument structure, meaning that its conclusion is necessarily true. It has to be true no matter what, so long as the premises are all true. So if 1 is true and 2 is true, the conclusion absolutely must be true. But just because it's valid does not mean it's sound. You can plug any phrase or sentence in for the variables P and Q, and you will have a valid argument. That means according to the laws of logic, you have a valid argument. Even if your argument is something silly and actually false, it could still be a valid argument. So valid, remember, is a technical term, which means the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. But what if the premises are not true? Then you don't have a sound argument. A sound argument, as it's defined on page 20 of your textbook, is an argument where the premises really are true, and so the conclusion really is true. Okay. Let's slow that down a little bit. Let's plug in something really silly and weird and get a valid argument that's not sound. Let P represent that Obama is Persian. I'm Persian, by the way. And let Q represent that Persian people have been the president of the United States of America before the year 2020. Okay. So this argument says that if Obama is Persian, then Persians have been president of the United States before 2020. Premise 2. Obama is Persian. The conclusion. Persians have been the president of the United States before the year 2020. What I just read to you is following the structure of modus ponens. What I just read to you is a valid argument, but it's not sound. It's not sound because the premises are actually false. It's false that Obama is Persian because Obama is not Persian. Since P is a false statement, the conditional statement that rests on the antecedent is also false, meaning the whole conclusion, though it's a valid conclusion, it's valid because if the premises were true, the conclusion would be false, is an unsound argument because one of the premises or both of the premises is false, and so the conclusion is false. Self-assessment number 7, page 20. It's asking us to say whether these 3 arguments are valid or invalid, and they're going to be one or the other. So A and B are both valid, and they're valid for the same reasons. They're both following the basic laws of logic. If the first premise and the second premise are true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true, and there's nothing funny going on here, so both of those are valid. B is invalid. B is really bad reasoning. It's invalid, and it is a logical fallacy. It's the fallacy of denying the antecedent. It sets it up as if it's a good argument, but then it's going to take the antecedent of that conditional statement and it's going to deny it, and that's how it gets its conclusion. Well, you can't do that according to the laws of logic. So let's look at this further. It says, if Holly was going to be late, she would have called, but she's not going to be late. So you take that antecedent of the conditional statement and you deny it, and then you try to get your conclusion that she's not going to call. And that is called denying the antecedent, and you cannot deny the antecedent to follow the rules of logic. But going to A, here you are just affirming the antecedent, which you are allowed to do. It says, either the Pirates won the game or the Braves did. They didn't both win, they didn't both lose. One won and the other lost. Then the second premise tells you that the Pirates did not lose. And then the conclusion has to be that the Braves won. If both of your premises are true, then the conclusion is true, and that means that it's valid. So A and C are valid, B is invalid. Now we're going to start reading from page 22 and talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. But what about strength and cogency? Are we just going to skip those? Yes, we are. Want to make your head spin? Think of what you mean when you use the word necessary. Think about what you mean when you use the word sufficient. Here's what you might think of, but with a spin for our class. By sufficient, we're going to mean something that is required and enough to make the conclusion true. Remember that sign for us is going to be representing the word or the concept conclusion. Well, necessary is going to be something that's required but not enough to make something true. Page 22, section 2.2. Necessary and sufficient conditions. Let's slow things down and make sure we know exactly what we're talking about. It's first very good that we notice that just adding the word only in front of the word if changes the meaning of a conditional statement. Now we're making things more complicated by adding the phrase if and only if to our conditional statement. That also changes things as well. So here is a flashcard that tells you which is which. In a conditional statement, remember it's just if ... then ... If we said if ... then ... we're just saying that this premise or this reason or this statement is a conditional. If we use the phrase only if ... we're saying that we have a necessary condition. If we said if and only if, we have not only a necessary but also a necessary and sufficient condition. You already have an example of a regular conditional statement that starts with if ... If P, then Q. And you already have an example of the only if, which is the necessary condition. You get an A in this class only if you have perfect attendance. This one is talking about a necessary relationship between having perfect attendance and getting an A in the class. It's telling us that perfect attendance is required, but not enough to have an A in the class. Doing what is necessary does not mean doing enough. Just because you did what's necessary does not mean you've satisfied everything there is to do. Whereas when you're talking about having done the sufficient thing, you've done everything that is necessary for you to do. You've also done enough of it. So let's compare this sentence that says only if. So you're a student in a class and you're asking the teacher, how do you get an A in the class? And they say this to you, that you get an A in the class only if you have perfect attendance. This is saying that to get an A, it is required that you have perfect attendance. Meaning if you don't have perfect attendance, whatever else grades you got on anything else, you're not going to get an A. It's necessary for you to get an A that you have perfect attendance. However, the teacher can keep going. Let's finish this sentence. You get an A in this class only if you have perfect attendance. You also need to do at least some homework. You also need to show up and take the final, even if you don't do great on the final. So now we're realizing that this statement alone does not give us the necessary and sufficient conditions for getting an A. It gives us a necessary condition. It tells us what we're required to do, but it doesn't tell us the sufficient condition. It doesn't tell us what is required and what would be enough. Let's compare this to the same scenario. You're a student in the class, you ask your teacher, how do I get an A? And your teacher says this statement instead. You get an A in this class if and only if you have perfect attendance. They can keep talking, but they're not going to tell you more that's required of you. This statement says that even if you failed all your tests, even if you did no other homework, it is possible for you to still get an A. Because you get an A in the class if and only if you have perfect attendance. Meaning, if you have perfect attendance, then you have done everything that is required of you and everything that is enough to get an A. So these two responses of your teacher tell you totally different things. The only if is telling you what's necessary, but there might be more things necessary. There might be not enough things that you have done to get an A if you only have a perfect attendance. Whereas this teacher is telling you with this statement that all you need to do, it would be enough. It is necessary and sufficient for you to get an A if you have perfect attendance. That means that when we're comparing these different kinds of conditional statements, that the only if statement is giving you an idea of what is necessary, but that doesn't mean that doing what's necessary is enough. The statement that goes blah, 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 if and only if, or if and only if, blah, 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 is giving you necessary and sufficient conditions. It's telling you that all you have to do, everything and all you have to do is this thing. So let's compare this in one other way. If you want to see the relationship between the P and the Q. So here's the necessary condition. It's telling you only if P, then Q, or Q only if P. I mean, you could rewrite this a number of different ways. But the idea is that, can you see that? Q is a necessary condition for P whenever P cannot occur without the occurrence of Q. Bringing that back to our example, it's telling you that you cannot get an A in the class unless you have perfect attendance. Now, let's go to that stronger version that gives us more information, the sufficient condition. When we're talking about if and only if, we're talking about the sufficient condition. And it looks like this, that P is a sufficient condition for Q whenever the occurrence of P is all that is needed for the occurrence of Q. So when we're talking about the example that we've been using, we're saying that all that is needed for you to get an A is that you satisfy that condition of having perfect attendance. If you do horribly on all your homework and you don't skip the final because you have to have perfect attendance, you show up and then you bomb it, you can still get an A in the class. In fact, it's true that you will or should get an A in the class so long as you have perfect attendance. That's what it means to satisfy a sufficient condition. It means that you did everything that was required and you did everything that's enough. Page 24, section 2.3, begins discussing deductive arguments. So let's back up and then move together slowly. Remember when we were discussing this argument, I said that it was valid. I said that it was valid because you can easily translate it into the form of a symbolic logical argument. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. This is modus ponens. It is one of the simplest argument forms for valid argument styles. It would be deductive. It's a deductive argument because it's trying to get at a true conclusion. If it wasn't trying to get at a true conclusion, it might still be a very good argument, but it would be a non-deductive argument. Non-deductive arguments give you conclusions that are not supposed to be true, although they might be. The non-deductive argument style is there to make the conclusion seem very likely or very plausible. From all your observations that Toyotas break down, you might try to convince somebody not to buy a Toyota. You're saying, look, my grandpa had a Toyota and it broke down. My uncle had a Toyota and it broke down and could never be fixed. Please don't buy a Toyota. All the Toyotas I've ever seen have always had issues with it. So what you're doing there with that kind of reasoning is you're saying it's very likely that you should not buy a Toyota. It's highly probable that if you bought a Toyota, it would have a problem just like all the other Toyotas that I've seen. What you're doing there is creating a conclusion that you're not trying to sell as true. You would never say it's absolutely true that whatever Toyota you buy will have a problem. You're just saying that given your life experiences, it's very likely that the Toyota is going to be problematic, and therefore you should probably not buy something that has so much history or track record with problematicality, if that's a word. When you're offering a deductive argument, you're saying, this is definitely true. Look at this. Look at this. I have a valid argument. It's true. It's true. When you have a non-deductive argument, you're saying, this is so likely, this is so plausible, look how strong this conclusion is. Pages 24, 25, and 26 go over just a few out of the many logical argument forms. Some of them are the valid forms, and some of them are invalid forms. When it's discussing the valid argument forms, it's talking about how to learn the rules of reasoning. So when it says things like if A then B, A, B, and that's going over modus ponens, which we have discussed in this video, it's telling you that, look, if you take any statement and you plug it in for A, and you take any statement and you plug it in for B, that argument is going to be a valid argument whether or not it's sound, meaning whether or not your conclusion is actually true. If the premises are true, the conclusion will be true because you plugged in information into the blueprint, the form, the structure of the laws of reasoning. So if you turn any of your ideas into statements that you then coherently plug into that or any of the other listed argument forms, you will have a valid argument. So if you wanted to break the laws of reasoning, you will have a bad argument. You can take something that's true and you can argue for it in a way that is bad reasoning. You'd have a true conclusion with bad reasons, so you'd have a bad argument ultimately. The pages 25 and 26 go over the invalid argument forms, which means these are ways to not reason, and there's plenty of other ways, but here are some known ones. I would like for everyone to go over those, but I don't think it's necessary for me to just read this part of the book to you out loud. Sorry, invalid arguments starts on page 26. So it talks about two of them, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. If you have an argument and you do either one of those moves, you have created a bad argument. Imagine that I give you the blueprint, the basic structure of a teepee, which is a kind of house. And you take whatever material you want and you follow the structure that I've given to you with that blueprint. And you create whatever you create. It will be a teepee. Imagine that I gave you materials and I said, well, I know that this is sheepskin, I know that this is cow skin, I know that this is rug. Take all of these different kinds of content and follow this blueprint for a teepee. And you go and you recreate what is on the blueprint. You will have made all these different kinds of teepee. They're still teepees because they follow the structure, the blueprint of a teepee, even though you've used different content. Okay. Analogously, if you take any idea that you have and you plug it into a valid argument form, you will have a valid argument. So even if you take crazy material, like the idea that Obama is Persian, then you plug that into a valid argument form like modus ponens, you will have a valid argument. So on page 24, you'll have a box on the right-hand side. It says valid argument forms. And it goes through some of them. Modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism, constructive dilemma, categorical syllogism. These are just a few of those blueprints to good reasoning. These are the laws of logic, so to speak. If you take any statement and you plug it in for A or B or C or D and you follow the entire argument that way without accidentally plugging in A for B or something wrong like that, you will have a valid argument. So if you study those valid argument forms on page 24 and you eventually come up with an argument, you can find a way to plug in the content that you're interested in proving and you put it into these forms, you will have a good, valid argument. It might not be sound because deductive argumentation is trying to go for validity. It's trying to go for truth. It can fall short of truth. You might have a valid argument that's not sound, but you will still have a good argument because it's valid. If you continue reading, and I hope you go through these, and you look at page 26, which indicates just two of the invalid argument forms. There are a ton, and another way to name these, if you try to look it up on the internet, it could be logical fallacies, aka invalid argument forms. These are ways that are popular of breaking the rules of reasoning, not in a good way. So if you affirm the consequent, which is the first invalid argument form that's discussed on page 26, That is a bad way to argue. That is an invalid argument. You can accidentally argue poorly for a true conclusion. So just because you give an invalid argument does not mean that you've given a false conclusion. But here we're identifying and understanding and analyzing arguments. It would be a bad argument, even if you're arguing for the truth. So you want to pay attention to these forms, the valid and the invalid. You want to make sure if you're arguing, you offer valid ones, and you want to be on the lookout or the hear out. That should be a phrase, and it's not. You want to be on the hear out for invalid argument forms. Page 27, section 2.5 talks about a priori and a posteriori arguments. But you can also apply these Latin concepts to our reasoning. When I'm trying to argue that something is the case and I'm trying to convince you of my conclusion, there's different kinds of reason that I can give you. It could be an a posteriori reasoning, or it can be a priori reasoning. The argument in general could be a posteriori or a priori, where these concepts are discussing different kinds of ways to verify information. You can have an a priori reason, you can have an a priori argument, you can have a priori facts. Some people say there are no such thing as a priori facts, but let's just set that aside. So when we're talking about a priori, we're saying before experience. Let's say I wanted to prove to you that two words you keep interchanging are not actually synonymous. For example, belief and judgment. You keep using the word belief. I think you want to say the word judgment. You say there's no difference. And then I try to give you reasons why belief and judgment are actually different words. Well, I'm not going to look to empirical facts. I'm not going to point at anything in the world. I don't need experience to argue the point that I think is true, which is that belief and judgment are not synonymous words. We're talking about the definition of belief. We're talking about the definition of judgment. And once we have those, I can show you how the definitions are not one and the same. If they are different, if I've rationalized for you their difference, then I can try to argue persuasively that belief and judgment are not the same words. But notice that all of that can happen prior to experience. That makes it an a priori reasoning or a priori conclusion or a priori argument. If, on the other hand, we're trying to have an a posteriori conversation, it's a conversation that depends on experience. I say, wow, it's so beautiful in Montana. I really want to go there. And you say, you've never been to Montana. How can you know? And I pull out my phone and I say, look at all these pictures of Montana. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. And I haven't actually gone there and experienced it firsthand as primary information. However, I have experienced it because through my visual perception, I have seen images of Montana. And so through that experience, I can try to convince you who has never seen pictures of Montana that actual Montana is a beautiful place with gorgeous sunrises and sunsets. And if it's by experience that I try to persuade you, or if it's by experience that I'm offering data to convince you, then it's a posteriori reasoning. Imagine that you're a student in a class and you are second from the best grade in the class. Number one is this kid, Sam, and you know that Sam cheated on the last test. If Sam fails, then you become graduating number one in the class. You go up to the teacher, the principal, whoever, somebody in charge, and you say, Sam needs to fail. Sam cheated. Anybody who cheats needs to fail. Sam cheated. Sam needs to... Okay, so you go on and you give him this same argument. This is going to be a posteriori reasoning. It's an a posteriori argument. If you remember, a posteriori means dealing with after experience in order to verify information or to supply information. If we wanted to test whether this is a true or good argument, we need to look at experience. We need to go to Sam and say, Sam, did you cheat? That could be one way to do it. Another way would be to look at his tests and find out some other way that if he cheated or not. But notice that if we do not have any empirical evidence, if we do not look out into the world and test whether he cheated or ask him or find out some other way to prove that he indeed cheated, we will not be able to have this argument. This argument you cannot make by closing your eyes into the world and just rationalizing and idealizing and thinking through things without looking into the world. So this would be an a posteriori argument. 2.6, page 28. Here we're getting some examples of non-deductive arguments. These are not the ones that are trying to tell you, here's what the truth is, here's a valid argument. But by going out and looking at experiences, it's going from observation to plausible possible inferences that we could draw, and it gives you 3 examples of 3 kinds of non-deductive arguments. And then there's a self-assessment, which is question number 10, and that, just like self-assessment question number 9, which I also skipped, are answered on page 30.